For tonight's panel, we welcome Anthony Arnove, Michael Schwartz, and Amy Goodman, each of whom I will introduce. We ask that the audience be respectful of our presentation and of the remarks given by our speakers. My name is Anita Foster, and I enlisted in the Army in 1998 and served until 2002. I now serve on the Board of Directors of Iraq Veterans Against the War. I joined the Army as an American who is extraordinarily proud of our country, our democracy, and our way of life. And tonight, we're looking at how the ways in which our way of life and our democracy are driving the global war on terror. What are the aims of this war? In his first State of the Union, after the invasion of Iraq, President George W. Bush stated, "Our aim is democratic peace." But he had told Bob Woodward before the invasion, as we think through Iraq, whether or we may or may not attack, I have no idea. But it will be for the objective of making the world peaceful. Actually, both the Clinton and Bush administrations embraced democratic peace. Clinton's national security strategy laid the groundwork, saying, the more that democracy and the political and economic liberalization take hold in the world, the safer our nation will be, and the more our people are likely to prosper. Neoconservative pundit and co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, Robert Kagan, tells us the United States is a liberal, progressive society through and through. And to the extent that Americans believe in power, they believe it must be a means of advancing the principles of a liberal civilization and a liberal world order. The expectation of the Bush administration was to overthrow Hussein and establish a democratic regime in Iraq that would pressure other regimes in the oil-rich region to democratize. They called it the democratic domino. Spread our virtues and satisfy our interests. Progressive analyst and writer David Reif offers a twist on ideological superiority, saying the human rights movement, whether wittingly or unwittingly, has increasingly become a force of the recolonization of the world in the name of human rights. Perhaps so. Condoleezza Rice compared the fight and the war on terrorism to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And liberals not only supported the Bush administration's policies abroad, but also found common cause with them at home. Even as the Bush administration placed significant restrictions on civil liberties, unapologetically justifying such actions as response to the exigencies of war, as was the flouting of the Geneva Conventions. When I was in the Army and trained as an interrogator, we were still specifically taught to uphold the Geneva Conventions, and we were taught that maintaining a norm against torture was pragmatic, even if principled. Torture doesn't yield reliable intelligence. But in the global war on terror, Bush argued, the war against terrorism ushers in a new paradigm and requires new thinking in the law of war. The administration's position has enjoyed bipartisan support. Democratic Senator John Rockefeller said of torture, "I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't take anything off the table." Vice President Cheney tells us the threat from terrorists cannot be contained or managed in the global war on terror in this way. He says the war against terror will not end in a treaty. There will be no summit meeting, no negotiations with terrorists. This conflict can only end in their complete and utter destruction. Perpetual war for perpetual peace. More recently, Democratic presidential hopeful Barack Obama argued that America is the last best hope of Earth. Our country alternates between isolationism when it cannot change the world and messianism when it can. And at times, the coercive regime change through outside intervention and global hegemony to actualize the dream of perpetual peace. At other times, it has eschewed going abroad in search of monsters, as John Quincy Adams said, in favor of inspiring democracy around the world from the shining city upon a hill. Which approach will the United States choose in pursuit of our aims going forward? Let's hear from our distinguished panelists on the aims of the global war on terror, the political, legal, economic context of Iraq and Afghanistan. First, we will hear from Anthony Arnove. Anthony is the author of Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal. He is also the editor of Iraq Under Siege, The Deadly Impact of Sanctions and War, and with Howard Zinn, Voices of a People's History of the United States. His latest book, The Essential Chomsky, is published by the New Press, and his writings have appeared in the Financial Times, The Nation, Mother Jones, Left Business Observer, Monthly Review, and other publications.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to speak here tonight alongside the courageous members of Iraq Veterans Against the War and alongside others who are committed to telling the truth about the illegal and unjust occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan and who are working to end those occupations. I would like to make 5 basic points about the 2 occupations, and then I'd like to draw 5 broader conclusions about the geopolitical considerations that I see driving U.S. policy. First, it's important to remind ourselves that the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were launched on false pretenses, and also to underscore that they continue on false pretenses. The Bush administration attacked Iraq claiming it was preempting the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and its connections to al-Qaeda. Today we know the full extent of manipulation of intelligence that was used to start a war that was offensive, not defensive in nature. In Afghanistan, Washington claimed to be carefully targeting terrorists who had attacked the United States, but instead targeted the civilian population of Afghanistan in an open form of collective punishment, which is banned under international law. The war's planners consciously sought to make the general population of Afghanistan suffer, hoping that would help bring down the Taliban regime and also to make an example of Afghanistan. And I think the organizers of this weekend's gathering should be commended that the banner behind us reads Iraq and Afghanistan, because all too often Afghanistan has become the forgotten occupation. Or worse, it has somehow become the good occupation to which we can contrast Iraq. And it's very important that IVAW is bringing the issue of Afghanistan into the discussion, not only because of how it's affecting the people of Afghanistan, but because so many of the soldiers, the troops that have fought in Iraq, also have had field experience in Afghanistan, and also so many of the people that you meet organizing among GIs, among veterans, have had their primary military experience in Afghanistan. They opposed the occupation there, and we have to find a way of involving them in our work, connecting these 2 vital issues. Second, the United States is not stemming, but is in fact fueling sectarian and civil conflict in both countries. In Afghanistan and Iraq, Washington has armed militias that are involved in attacks on civilians, using alliances with the United States to gain money and weapons, and also to call in airstrikes and ground attacks to settle political and sectarian scores. In Afghanistan, as the analyst Stephen Zunis notes, the United States subcontracted security of much of the country to warlords who have actually served to destabilize the country. The United States has used classic colonial divide and rule tactics in both countries for the same reason that all occupations of necessity must, to control and impose the occupier's will upon a population that will not consent to its subjugation. This means the violence we have seen, the torture and homicides at Bagram and Abu Ghraib and beyond, are the logical result, are in fact the inevitable outcome of U.S. policy at the highest levels. The violence does not have its origin in the ideas of the troops or a few bad apples, but emanates from the political leadership and policy set at the top of the chain of command, and from the systematic violence and racism of both occupations. And as we've heard in testimony today, they stem from rules of engagement that guarantee civilians will be degraded, dehumanized, tortured, and killed. Third, the U.S. is not confronting terrorism by staying in Iraq or Afghanistan, as we're often told. The main enemy that the U.S. is confronting in both countries is not al-Qaeda, but the very people we claim to have liberated. As Army Captain Dan Kearney told the New York Times Magazine, speaking about the occupation of Afghanistan, the only reason anyone's listening to me is because I'm dropping bombs on them. In Iraq, poll after poll, including polling done by the U.S. government itself through the State Department and other agencies it's employed, has found that the Iraqis say that they want an end to the occupation, that they view us as occupiers, not as liberators, that they feel less safe, not more safe as a result of our presence, and they see us as the main source of instability and the main source of sectarian conflict in their country. And let's be clear, this is not a question of mismanagement, of bad planning, or of lack of planning, or an error in this or that counterinsurgency strategy. Is it a political, fundamental reality of the occupation? As long as we remain, we will be the source of the instability and the violence. Fourth, the United States is not honoring those who died in Iraq and Afghanistan by continuing the occupations, as President Bush claims. Now more than 4,400 U.S. troops have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. In addition, though this number is rarely mentioned, more than 1,000 private contractors have been killed alongside U.S. forces, as well as scores of journalists, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead. More than 29,000 U.S. troops have been wounded, many severely. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have skyrocketed, as have suicide rates, among many other problems that people have discussed and given personal testimony about in this hearing. Each additional death and injury only compounds the senseless tragedy we have seen so far. Fifth, the United States is not rebuilding or bringing democracy to either country. Despite the billions of dollars Congress has allocated for reconstruction efforts, electricity and access to safe drinking water are below pre-invasion levels in Iraq. Unemployment has skyrocketed as a result of conscious policy decisions taken by the occupation authorities. Inflation is spiraling, again as a result of conscious economic decisions made by the occupation, putting basic necessities out of reach of most Iraqis. Hospitals are in shambles. And Iraq today has the world's largest and fastest growing refugee crisis, with more than 2.2 million internally displaced and more than 2.2 million externally displaced Iraqis. Child malnutrition in Iraq has grown worse. The UN, the United Nations, reports that 1 in 4 Iraqi children under 5 now suffers chronic malnourishment, and more than 4 million Iraqis are in need of food assistance. But the country's food ration program is being eliminated as part of the neoliberal reconstruction of Iraq under the direction of the U.S. occupation. In Afghanistan, only 6% of the population has electricity at any point in the day, according to the Asian Development Bank. And Action Aid International estimates that only 14% of U.S. aid to Afghanistan has reached legitimate development projects. Now, women's oppression in Afghanistan, which we should remember was cited by many proponents of the invasion of Afghanistan as a reason why this was a humanitarian, why this was a just war, is as bad and in some cases worse than before the invasion. The independent newspaper in London recently reported that, quote, grinding poverty and the escalating war is driving an increasing number of Afghan families to sell their daughters into forced marriages. Girls as young as 6 are being married into a life of slavery and rape, often by multiple members of their new relatives. Banned from seeing their own parents or siblings, they are also prohibited from going to school. With little effective recourse, many of the victims are driven to self-immolation, burning themselves to death or severe self-harm. Civilian casualties in Iraq are now at post-invasion highs, thanks in part to an expanded U.S. air war, a model we now see being applied with greater frequency in Iraq. To give a figure, between January and September 2007 alone, U.S. and NATO coalition allies dropped 1 million pounds of ordnance on Afghanistan. That's more than double the entire year of 2006, the figure for 2006. To those who argue we broke it, so we must fix it, rather than fixing the two countries, we are only breaking them further. And to those who say we cannot withdraw precipitously, there's nothing precipitous about pulling out after 5 years, or in the case of Afghanistan, 7 years of occupying another country illegally. We have no right to be in either country in the first place. Senator John McCain said recently, troops may have to stay in Iraq for 100 or 1,000 or even 10,000 years, he said. His position's clear. But I think we have to acknowledge as well that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidates, also would not end the occupation of Iraq or of Afghanistan. As the Wall Street Journal reported on February 29th, despite the rhetoric of the Democratic presidential candidates, significant numbers of U.S. troops will remain in Iraq regardless of who wins in November. Indeed, if you look at their actual proposals, Senators Clinton and Obama have said we must keep troops in Iraq for counterterrorism operations, for force protection, and training Iraq soldiers, so-called Iraqification. The Journal notes that, quote, conducting such missions would require the sustained development of tens of thousands of American military personnel, foreign policy advisors from both campaigns acknowledge. This is a perfect example of the circular logic of occupation. If there were no U.S. troops and no U.S. military bases in Iraq, and if the United States were not building in Baghdad the largest U.S. embassy or largest embassy of any government in the world in history, and if you didn't have the presence of more than 150,000 U.S. contractors in Iraq, you wouldn't need other troops for force protection. Counterterrorism, of course, is the same rationale that President Bush offers for why troops must stay. And training is the same discredited argument of Bush. As the Iraqis stand up, we will stand down. In addition, Senators Clinton and Obama have both talked about increasing overall U.S. troop levels by tens of thousands and adding more troops to the occupation of Afghanistan, including some of the troops that may potentially be redeployed from Iraq. One top aide to the Obama campaign, interviewed recently by journalist Jeremy Scahill, writing in The Nation magazine, even left open the possibility that if elected president, Obama would rely on greater numbers of mercenaries from companies such as Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and DynCorp in Iraq to replace troops redeployed to other theaters. And it's important to acknowledge that because that means that the work that Iraq Veterans Against War is doing, the work that people are organizing this weekend, is so important and has to continue no matter who is in office in 2009. The reason that the Democrats aren't providing an alternative, the reason that they've continued to fund the war in Congress after saying that they oppose the war, and in many cases being elected on the basis of that position, is that the geopolitical stakes for the United States are so high. Neither party, neither the Republicans or the Democrats, wants to preside over a defeat of the United States in Afghanistan or Iraq and manage the consequences that would follow. To understand why, we can dispense with all the public relations reasons for these wars. WMD, Al-Qaeda, liberating people living in tyrannical regimes, none of which hold up to scrutiny, and should instead look at the geopolitical interests driving both occupations. And here I want to make 5 brief points. First, Afghanistan and Iraq were meant to have a demonstration effect, signaling to other states around the world that the U.S. government has the right, which it will on a limited basis extend to allies such as Israel, to engage in preemptive strikes against any country it chooses, that it will defer to the United Nations and other international bodies only when it suits its ends, and will dismiss them as irrelevant otherwise, and that it will allow no challenge to the credibility of U.S. imperialism. As one unnamed hawk quoted in the New York Times put it, by setting up our military in Iraq, we can set an example to other countries. We can set an example to other countries. If you cooperate with terrorists or menace us in any way, or even look at us cross-eyed, this could happen to you. Second, the invasions were intended to give the United States greater control over the Middle East and Central and Western Asia, home to the vast majority of the world's oil reserves, most of the world's natural gas reserves, and also home to vital pipelines and shipping routes for energy. In the words of former Bush speechwriter David Frum, an American-led overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the replacement of the radical Ba'athist dictatorship with a new government more closely aligned with the United States would put America more wholly in charge of the region than any power since the Ottomans, or maybe even the Romans. That was the objective. The United States' interest in Middle Eastern and Asian energy is not primarily motivated by consumption needs, but motivated by geopolitical advantages that flow from controlling this oil and natural gas. U.S. policy planners understand that the main power centers that could emerge as peer rivals to the United States in the future, and that could threaten its status as the world's sole superpower, namely India and China, the combined countries of the European Union, all are more reliant on energy imports from the Middle East than is the United States. Regional hegemony, therefore, gives the United States tremendous leverage and influence vis-a-vis competing economic and military powers that are dependent on these energy resources. As oil gets more expensive to extract, and as exploration is forced to seek out more dangerous geographic and political terrain for new oil finds, control over these energy resources and trade routes has grown more important to U.S. imperial strategy than even before, and it's always been an central axiom of U.S. foreign policy in the past several decades. Third, the plan for a quick and easy victory and regime change in both Afghanistan and Iraq was meant to establish client states in these two strategically located countries and provide the United States with important bases for military personnel and equipment, and also bases for projection of U.S. power, particularly to isolate and engineer regime change, ideally, in nearby Iran and Syria. These regional bases of power were also intended to enhance the ability of the United States to project power globally. That is, Washington hoped to use regional hegemony to preserve and expand its global hegemony, enhance its ability to intervene economically and politically in the affairs of any country around the world where the U.S. has interests, using U.S. military might to bully countries into compliance with its political and its economic program. Of course, this has backfired. Instead of being in a stronger position, the United States is in a weaker position regionally and internationally. But in many ways, this has only further raised the stakes. In particular, Iran has emerged as a more powerful regional player as a result of U.S. actions in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And we see, as a result, greater threats of an attack on Iran, particularly an aerial attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, or alleged nuclear facilities, which are also intended to facilitate regime change in that country. Meanwhile, Venezuela and Russia have also started to develop new energy relationships with Iran and other countries to develop independent trade relations and energy supply routes that threaten U.S. control and domination of energy markets. And keep in mind that Venezuela is a leading supplier of oil to the United States, and that Russia has the world's largest supply of natural gas reserves. Fourth, both occupations were linked to a set of economic objectives that extend far beyond the question of the huge subsidies and profits created for political allies in the national security, military, industrial complex, and extend to the much bigger prize of imposing a neoliberal model throughout all the Middle East and Western and Central Asia that would give the United States privileged access to these markets and open them to much greater foreign ownership and control. Fifth, the Bush administration thought that by its invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, it could bury once and for all the so-called Vietnam syndrome, eliminating the public's reluctance to see Washington intervene militarily in the affairs of other countries and undermining international opposition to U.S. unilateralism. In other words, they wanted to overcome the defeat that the brave veterans from Vietnam and VVAW and the other groups that organized against that war achieved in defeating the United States in Vietnam, and the legacy, the very important legacy they created. And that's very important to acknowledge. And that's why they're holding on so tenaciously to the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan to salvage some other outcome, no matter what the human cost. These were the real objectives that drove the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and that explain why the United States is continuing both occupations, despite all the harm they have caused to the Iraqi people, to the people of Afghanistan, to the people of the region, and to the U.S. troops being asked to wage these unjust and illegal wars. The truth is, the architects of both occupations have contempt for the people of Iraq and Afghanistan that they claim to have liberated, and they have contempt for the very troops they claim so loudly to support. The best way we can support the troops in reality is to bring them home now, not in 16 months or in 16 years, and to provide them the social, economic, medical, and psychological assistance that they need and deserve. Genuine support, not bumper sticker slogans and empty rhetoric. And the best way we can support the people of Afghanistan and Iraq is to withdraw from their countries immediately and unconditionally and pay reparations for the enormous harm and destruction that we have caused, opening the possibility for the genuine humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, and self-determination these countries desperately need. We cannot count on our elected or unelected officials to realize their folly and end the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan and the imperial project of which they are a component part. Only pressure of a movement that centrally includes soldiers, veterans, and their families can bring that about. The stakes really could not be higher for the people of Iraq, for the people of Afghanistan, for the people of this country, or really for the people of the world. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, Anthony.